Well, then let me begin. I want to begin with the siege of Sarajevo. Now, for many of you, this was before some of you might have even been born, but it lasted for nearly 4 years between 1992 and 1996, during the violent breakup of the former Yugoslavia. Bosnia and Herzegovina had declared independence, but the Bosnian Serb forces, supported by the regime of Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia, surrounded the city. Sarajevo became the longest siege in modern European history. Civilians were trapped under constant shelling and sniper fire. Markets, schools, apartment blocks, hospitals, bread queues all became targets, and indeed more than 10,000 people were killed. During those years, ordinary routines gave way to survival. Water had to be gathered under sniper fire. Electricity, of course, was intermittent. Children learned to distinguish the sounds of incoming mortars. And yet, in the midst of that destruction, there emerged one of the enduring images of the time. A cellist named Vedran Smailović sat among the ruins and played. On May 27th, 1992, artillery shells struck a bakery, killing 22 people. The next day, he got dressed in his concert attire and played Albinoni's Adagio in G minor on the site. And he repeated that every single day for 22 days, one for each victim. He continued performing amid the sniper fire, and his presence offered solace to the residents trapped there. Indeed, just to let you know, coming from Ireland, Smailović later settled here, and where he continues to compose and teach. The image, though, remains unsettling because it reveals something essential about peace. The cellist wasn't stopping tanks, he wasn't negotiating treaties, but the music somehow became a refusal to allow the logic of destruction to define reality completely. So let me turn to Europe, because the war in former Yugoslavia is a defining moment in what we might describe as the endeavor of Europe. Europe, at its heart, is a creation of both war and peace. But speaking about it as a common endeavor, certainly in recent generations, it is always understood at its best moments that peace is far more than just the absence of war. Peace depends upon a certain vision of the human person. Political institutions matter enormously, and you'll learn a little bit more about them. Economic stability matters enormously. The law matters enormously. But beneath all of these lies a deeper question. How are we to be human together? How are we to be human together? This presentation wants to introduce the idea that we will explore in different ways during our week together. Beneath every social order lies an understanding of the human person. And when that understanding becomes thin, fragmented, ideological, technological, utilitarian, peace itself becomes unstable. So what is at stake at Europe at the moment is a deeper uncertainty about what human beings are about, what binds them together, what kind of truths are necessary for common life. So the structure of my input, I want to do several things. First, as I've already stated, I want to suggest that the deepest contemporary European crises are actually human ones, or what we might say is anthropological. They are a deeper crisis as much as they are a political one. Second, I'm going to turn to one of the heroes of my growing up, and indeed of Europe for the past generations, Václav Havel from the former Czechoslovakia, and his analysis about society, truthfulness, and freedom. In short, I'm going to make him a voice of European humanism. Third, while working through his classic text called Power of the Powerless, I'm going to refer to some contemporary trends and challenges and how his ideas might be taking on new forms in our time. And then lastly, I just briefly want to draw upon the Catholic intellectual tradition, and especially a document that was just released in the last couple of days by Pope Leo XIV on war and peace. It's actually on AI, but there is a section on war and peace. You're all more than aware that Europe is going from crisis to crisis. There's the war in Ukraine and the return of large-scale conflict to the European continent. We've got anxieties around migration and borders. There's growing economic inequality, especially among younger generations who struggle with housing, jobs, and so on. There's the rise of populist movements. There's a lingering distrust after the pandemic years that you, in your early years, would have grown up in. These are questions about Europeans. There's also questions about Europe's place within an unstable global order, as we see the drama, and never-ending drama that comes from the United States, how it relates to China, and so on. But there's also other significant issues that are in the background, such as demographic decline. The list could go on. But my basic point that I'd like to share with you is that while these questions can be discussed as political or economic problems and technical problems, there is a danger that we can only stay at that level. Beneath many of these crises lies a deeper one, a weakening of a shared understanding of the human person and being able to recognize each other as human people, and so acknowledge the moral obligations that bind each other together. When confidence in human dignity weakens, public life becomes brittle. Public discourse becomes more performative and indeed more tribal. And citizens don't encounter each other as neighbours or indeed fellow participants in a common project, but as ideological opponents, indeed digital profiles or just numbers. So we end up, I would argue, in a very new place in the 21st century. We don't have totalitarianism in the sense of the 20th century. Europe is quite different from then, but there are new powers, new forms, should I say, of power, new systems of hegemony. So I'm going to use a term that was first proposed by Václav Havel called post-totalitarianism. So I'm going to draw on a phrase used by him to suggest that we do live in a post-totalitarian era. That is not, and I have to come in very quickly to say, that is not to say we live without totalitarianism. It's just that totalitarianism in the old form is actually being played out in a new way. So Havel argues that post-totalitarian systems are sustained by two significant features of our society: consumer society and technology. Now, he wrote in the late 1970s, I think it'd be kind of his diagnosis is even more true today, whereby consumerism and technology are extremely strong markers of our society. The first, in a sense, that is, consumer society numbs people, or at best creates a kind of a compromise between power and economic benefits. The second, that's technology, leads people to being reduced to serve the system, we could say the algorithm, rather than being masters of it. So a post-totalitarian system of power does not rely on fear or violence. It depends on ordinary people outwardly conforming to accepted rituals and slogans, even when they no longer believe in them. Its power lies precisely in how normalized conformity becomes. Okay, so I'm making Václav Havel the conversation partner today. I would argue that he remains remarkably important. His great insight was that political systems ultimately depend upon how people live, whether they live according to a lie or within a lie, or whether they live according to a truth. The primary essay that I'm focusing in on, the one for which he is most famous, is called The Power of the Powerless and was written in 1978 and emerged from the communist Czechoslovakia before the crushing of the Prague Spring. Havel himself was not primarily a politician. He was a playwright, an intellectual who became a dissident when he became increasingly alarmed by the moral consequences of ideological systems that he was living through. That Soviet invasion in 1968 of the Prague Spring extinguished any hopes of socialism with the human face, as it was called at the time. But what he feared most was what followed afterwards, in what the regime called normalization, the outward social stability purchased at the cost of truthfulness and freedom. Okay, so Havel observed that that his systems no longer depend primarily, as I said, upon terror. Instead, they depended upon participation, but a particular type of participation. And he begins his essay with an example of a greengrocer. The greengrocer places in the shop window of his shop the slogan, "Workers of the world unite." Many of you will recognize that phrase from Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto. The greengrocer may not believe the slogan at all. He may barely think about it, yet he displays it because the system expects him to do so. The sign becomes less a statement of conviction and more a signal of conformity. So that's important. It's about conformity. Hegel's insight, I believe, is profound. Systems of untruth endure not simply because people are forced to obey, but because ordinary people adapt themselves to, and this is one of his most famous quotes, living within the lie. Over time, moral language becomes hollowed out. Human beings begin to live divided internally. While not living under the same systems today, Havel's insight remains remarkably relevant because the temptation towards performative conformity continues across all societies. I might ask you to just pause for a moment yourselves. Where would performative conformity continue in our societies? In what way do people do things because it's expected, because it's a ritual, even though their heart may not be in it, or indeed they've just made a compromise? Yet the Power of the Powerless essay is not fundamentally a pessimistic one. Havel believed that the truth possesses a strange resilience. His central argument is that systems built upon lies actually are vulnerable. They're vulnerable because eventually they are unable to resist falsification. It's a call to the simple act of living within the truth. Living within the truth, we'll explain a little bit more, actually becomes politically and spiritually significant. Okay, so let me just follow through on his central insights from that wonderful essay. So, firstly, this is going to be repeating myself a little bit, modern systems depend upon participation, not only force. So his first major insight is that post-totalitarian systems do not simply police repression, are not powerful through repression or fear, but because ordinary people participate through conformity. They outward repeat slogans and gestures and even have expectations they may not truly believe in. And the system becomes sustained through everyday accommodation. Secondly, ideology creates a world of appearance. Havel argues that ideology functions as a veil between people and reality. It allows both rulers and citizens to avoid confronting the truth directly. Public language is detached from genuine meaning. He writes that ideology offers people, and I quote, the illusion of identity and dignity and morality, while making it easier for them to part with them. The third point he makes is that people gradually learn to live within the lie. One of Havel's most famous ideas is that the system deforms people morally by encouraging to live publicly in ways that contradict private conviction. Human beings become divided internally. So the individual, and I quote, does not need to accept a lie. It's enough for them to have accepted the life within it. The danger is not merely censorship, but the gradual normalization of untruthfulness. But here's the thing. This is his fourth point. Despite all that conformity might bring about, there will always be a conflict between the aims of life and the aims of the system. Havel argues that at its deepest, there ends up being a struggle that is spiritual, moral, or we might call it, give it the bigger word, anthropological. In other words, people are divided within. While the system seeks conformity and predictability and self-preservation, human life itself will continue to seek truth, freedom, meaning, authentic relationship, and these will ultimately clash. The tension will continually remain. He writes, while life moves towards its own plenitude, the system serves people only to the extent necessary to ensure that people will serve it in turn. But that can only go so far. Systems become dangerous when persons are reduced to functions within the machinery of power. Okay. The fifth point is again one that I mentioned earlier, about consumerism and technology. Havel insists that post-totalitarian conformity is not sustained by ideology alone. It is reinforced by modern consumer culture and technological civilization. People become reluctant to sacrifice comfort, convenience, or security for moral integrity. So for Havel, the crisis extends beyond Eastern Europe of that time, I would argue, into our own contemporary era. Conscious of time, so I'm going to just try and kind of move along quickly. So we become then to Havel's proposals. So his sixth point is that if the danger is that we live within a lie, the act of resistance is to live within the truth. Against conformity, Havel proposes what he calls living within the truth. This does not necessarily mean a dramatic political rebellion. It is often small acts of honesty, responsibility, refusal to participate in falsehood. So the point where living within the truth ceases to be mere negation of living within the lie and becomes articulation of a particular way is the point in which something is born that we might call the independent life of a society. Truthfulness creates space for genuine freedom. And that takes us to the last point about how this might lead to political renewal. Havel ultimately argues that political change cannot be sustained without moral and spiritual change. Freedom depends upon persons capable of responsibility, truthfulness, and inward integrity. So near the end of his essay, he writes, living within the truth as humanity's revolt against an enforced position can have only one form, a struggle to regain control over one's sense of responsibility. I went through a lot there and went through it quite quickly, but I just want to do so in order to change the direction of the conversation and to bring in a second interlocutor or second conversation partner. And that is Pope Leo XIV and his encyclical that just came out a couple of days ago called Magnifica Humanitas, Some of you might have come across it or have certainly heard about it. Quite simply, this document, and it's his first encyclical. An encyclical is a letter to the world, and it's the highest form of teaching by a pope. And this encyclical is primarily directed towards artificial intelligence and how a moral evaluation, shall we call it, within the Catholic tradition of artificial intelligence. But there's a significant part of it that directly relates to war and peace. So the document repeatedly warns against what he calls a culture of power, a political or technological mentality willing to sacrifice human dignity in pursuit of advantage. He goes on to talk about the normalization of war in our current era. He argues that Europe and the wider world are entering into a dangerous moment where it's becoming psychologically normalized again. An example of that might be the significant growth in defense spending in recent years. So there's a real paradigm shift, he writes, in public discourse and decisions regarding rearmament. The encyclical also expresses alarm at the growing acceptance of permanent militarization, but he argues that I'm trying to summarize what I have in my pages here because I'm looking at the clock. He basically, his concern again is anthropological. He is approaching the issues from the point of view of what does it mean to be human, and therefore he turns to artificial intelligence, whereby he's insisting on ethical responsibility can never be delegated to artificial intelligence or machines of any sort, regardless of how sophisticated it becomes. He writes in one place, "It is not permissible to entrust lethal or otherwise irreversible decisions to artificial systems," adding with clarity that no algorithm can make war morally acceptable. So in response, he, like Havel, is also, while concerned about society, is trying to be hopeful. Leo repeatedly insists that human beings do remain capable of goodness, solidarity, and moral renewal. So his answer to the culture of power is to use an older phrase called the civilization of love, whereby society is grounded in the conviction that persons should never be reduced to instruments of any sort. At one point, in anticipating accusations of pessimism, he actually uses a quote from The Lord of the Rings. Many of you might have read it, certainly some of you will have seen the movies. And it quotes Gandalf the wizard. So I'd say it's the first time a wizard has ever been quoted by a pope. And the quote goes like this: "It is not our part to master all the tides of the world, but to do what is in us for the succor of those years within we are set, uprooting the evil in the fields that we know, so that those who live after us may have a clean earth to till." It's a fitting quotation with which to move to a conclusion, because in a sense, what I'm kind of would like to propose for you to think about is the idea, and I'm returning back to Havel. He spoke about being a dissident. He was conscious of that title being used about him in his struggle in communist Czechoslovakia. But in the essay Power of the Powerless, he spends time trying to define a dissident. And in short, he argues that the true dissidents are those who live the quiet lives of truthfulness, and rather than those who are heroic or revolutionary. The dissident is the person who refuses dehumanization in any way, particularly those who might fall for conformity. They insist that truth matters. And living within the truth, to use a quote by him again near the end of his essay, is humanity's revolt against the enforced position can have only one form: a struggle to regain control over one's own sense of responsibility. In many ways, the cellist of Sarajevo was a dissident. He expressed the truth of a deeper sense of what it is to be human. And it is, in a sense, the cultivation of the deeper sense of being human and the identification of that in each other is ultimately a great act of dissidence against power in all its forms, and especially in its crudest form of violence and war. So I'm kind of, in a sense, throwing it back on you all. None of us are at the war front. None of us are at the negotiation table. But we do have a part to play in the building of peace. And I'd like to suggest that the building of peace is ultimately about living lives of truthfulness, a sense of deep integrity, about understanding who and what we are and who and what each other are and is. So I want you to putting that sense of responsibility back on you, and maybe to think about that in our time before we gather together for the week. What are the type of responsible acts of truthfulness that are appropriate in your own life? Because by it, we become shaped as people, we become morally responsible, and ultimately, in a sense, build societies and people that are the best bulwarks against violence and for peace. So I'll leave you with that conclusion. And you've already been divided into groups and questions that might fall out of this. And thank you all very, very much for listening. Thank you.